Kia ora guys, Michelle here. In this video, we are going to cover off all of the different accommodation options you have if you're planning on a long distance hike of Te Araroa. Now before we get started, don't forget, if you've been watching these Te Araroa trail preparation videos for a little while, you'll know that this video is only going to cover the North Island section of Te Araroa, as that is all that I have currently completed. Even though I feel pretty confident that I could give you all the information you'll need about hiking the South Island, I'd rather leave it until I've actually finished that section of the trail to tell you guys all about your options on that section. So as far as the North Island section of Te Araroa goes, you're generally speaking going to have 4 different options for where you can stay whilst you're on the trail. And those are going to be camping, staying with trail angels, staying in a formal facility like a backpackers or a hostel or a motel, and then also staying in some of the huts that are out there along the route. I'm going to cover all of these different options in detail. Specifically, I'm going to be giving you information about how much it costs, what the facilities are like at each of those different locations, and any other information that you need to know about staying at those particular places. So first things first, we are going to cover campgrounds and camping on the Te Araroa Trail. And I've decided to cover this topic first because it is by far and away the majority of the accommodation that you're going to be in whilst you're hiking the North Island section of the trail. So what are the options when it comes to camping? Well, there are a variety of different ones, ranging right from your formal campgrounds where you might be staying in a holiday park or something similar in a town that you're passing through, right the way through to DOC or Department of Conservation campsites, which range in facilities and price per night, and then of course all the way through to freedom camping whilst you're out on the trail itself. So how much does it cost to camp on the Te Araroa Trail? Well, it is going to vary widely. You could be paying as little as $8 to camp in DOC campsites along the way, all the way right the way through to $25 or more a night to stay at a campground. In most cases, these costs are per adult, not per tent or per site. Now, throughout most of the North Island, you are probably going to be staying in formal campgrounds or campsite facilities such as holiday parks along the way. These are going to be a little bit more expensive, but the facilities that you get there are usually a lot better. So for example, you will generally always get a hot shower and a flushing toilet. There will usually be some sort of cooking facilities, and you'll probably even get laundry facilities at the same time. Just bear in mind that if you are planning on staying in these formal campgrounds, you're probably going to have to pay for things like hot showers and your laundry facilities. And as an average, I'd say roughly a shower would cost me anywhere between 50 cents to as much as $2, and laundry facilities would cost me from as little as $2 all the way up to about $6 to do a load. You will need to carry coins in order to pay for these services at those facilities. Obviously, if you're staying at a formal campsite or campground, there is more than likely going to be running water there, which you do not have to filter. Now on the other end of the spectrum, as I mentioned, there are also a certain number of DOC or Department of Conservation campsites along the way as well. And generally speaking, they fall into one of 4 categories too. So you have your standard serviced campsites, which generally include a few more facilities. Then you go into your scenic or standard campsites, which have slightly less facilities. Then you go right into your basic campsites, which will probably just be a piece of grass in an open clearing somewhere, maybe with a toilet. And then we also have backcountry campsites, which sort of depend on where they are as to the facilities and the cost. Your serviced campsites are going to be about the most expensive out of the lot. They're going to range anywhere from about $15 to $20 per night. Then you're going to come down into your standard or your scenic campsites, which you can probably get for anywhere between $8 and $15 per night. And then your basic campsites are generally going to be free just because of that lack of facilities. I'll leave a link to the Department of Conservation websites you're going to need to check in the description bar down below. And while I'm on that subject, don't forget to go and check that description, because I'm going to link all of the resources that I mention in this video down there too. So as I mentioned, the service campsites are going to have a pretty full range of facilities. I'm talking about things like potentially flushing toilets, full cooking facilities, and then water that you probably don't need to filter. But as you start moving down through the scenic and the standard campsites all the way through to the basic and some of the backcountry campsites, those facilities do diminish. In most cases, if you're staying on Department of Conservation land, you're probably not going to have flushing toilets. You're going to have a long drop, or what some people know as pit toilets. And just bear in mind that you do need to use these toilets if you are going number 2. We don't advocate digging cat holes here in New Zealand unless it is absolutely necessary. Sometimes you'll get water from a rainwater collection tank, but most of the time you're probably going to have the campsite next to a stream or somewhere that you can collect water from. So in general, I didn't book any of my campsites along the way, and that was because, generally speaking, I was staying at larger campgrounds where I knew that there was going to be plenty of space. This is where having an app like Guthook comes in handy, because you can easily check ahead to see if anybody who's gone through before you has left any comments about whether they struggle to find a campsite or not. If you don't have Guthook though, then there are other ways that you can try and get that information. There are always the Facebook forums, and the Te Araroa Facebook forums in particular are very active every year, so I would encourage you to go and take a look at those. If you are in doubt though, or if you are particularly worried about a particular section, then I would suggest that you just ring ahead to the campground that you are planning on staying at, or if it's a dock facility that you're planning on using, just give your local dock office, wherever you're closest to, a call on the phone and just ask them what's the best option for you. Okay, so let's talk about that very controversial topic, freedom camping and stealth camping on Te Araroa. Now, in general, freedom camping is permitted on Te Araroa as long as you're following the very specific rules that have been set down for it. So why are all these rules in place around freedom camping and stealth camping in New Zealand? Well, New Zealand has had a very negative history with freedom camping, especially in the last few years that it's been popular. Basically, we've had a lot of tourists coming into the country, picking up their camper vans and then going to tour the country on a shoestring budget. And this has led to them staying in some designated freedom camping sites and some non-designated freedom camping sites along their journeys. Now, I'm not sure what the freedom camping facilities are like overseas, but I get the impression that perhaps some of the tourists expect a little bit more from freedom camping in New Zealand. And despite the fact that they have their chemical toilets in their camper vans, they seem to much prefer the nature experience of going outside to do their business. Unfortunately, a lot of these people are not well versed in leave no trace principles, and aside from not digging themselves cat holes to go toilet into, they're usually leaving their used toilet paper strewn all around, all over our beautiful countryside that we work so hard to protect here in New Zealand. So that's why freedom camping gets the reputation that it gets here in New Zealand, but also you have to consider the fact that the way the Te Araroa Trail has been constructed means that a lot of it is routed through private land. And as such, we are effectively entering into an agreement with those landowners that we're going to pass through their land without causing them any nuisance or damage, and that we're going to leave it as we find it. Now, unfortunately, there have been instances of Te Araroa hikers in the past illegally camping on private land and leaving behind a mess for those landowners to clean up. And in some cases, it's meant that the trail has been forbidden from going through that private land, and we have lost our access agreements with those landowners. So you can see how just one simple act of maybe stealth camping on one piece of land on one night on your Te Araroa thru hike could have serious domino and knock-on effects for future Te Araroa hikers. So how can you make sure that you're complying with these rules? Well, first and foremost, you need to stick to what the Te Araroa Trust says in its trail notes. They've done a really great job of putting all the the accommodation options into their trail notes and specifically telling you areas that you can't camp in. So pay attention to those and read the upcoming section of trail notes for each section before you get to it, so that you can get a good idea in your head of where you might be able to camp and where you might not. So how on earth do I know where I can freedom camp on Te Araroa? Well, this is something that I didn't really understand before I set out, but I found that just in the process of hiking, it started to become really clear along the way. For a start with, often it is signposted very clearly if you are not allowed to camp along a section. Usually these signs are either put up by the Department of Conservation, if it's a piece of public conservation land, or they're put up by the private landowners of the section that you're about to pass through. Now personally, I hiked the entire length of the North Island and I didn't find any need to freedom camp anywhere along the trail. And that's because you're generally always passing through a town or through some sort of facility where you can pitch your tent for a small fee every night. But I do understand that there are those of you out there who want to minimize on those fees that you're paying, and that's why freedom camping is a good option. So if you're still struggling to figure out whether the piece of land you're passing through is public conservation land or whether it's private land, then I'll leave a link to a Department of Conservation GIS map in the description down below, where you can easily toggle on and off an overlay which tells you which areas of land are public conservation land. That map also has a nice overlay about areas where freedom camping is either restricted or prohibited, so make sure you check that out. There are general principles that you need to make sure you're following if you're planning on freedom camping along the trail, and I've already touched on some of these, like the leave no trace principles. So make sure you pack all of your rubbish out, make sure that if you do have to toilet and there isn't a toilet nearby, that you are digging yourself an adequate cat hole and that it is far enough away from water sources that it's not going to contaminate them. Some people will pack out their toilet paper, but if you don't want to do that, make sure it's nicely buried into that cat hole, and just generally make sure that you leave that campsite the same condition as when you found it. Make sure also that you are paying attention to fire bans in the region that you're hiking through. So the Te Araroa hiking season usually takes place over the New Zealand summer, and just lately we've been having massive issues with drought in New Zealand, especially up in the far north of the North Island and also the far north of the South Island. And if all of that fails, then the golden rule of freedom camping is ask first. Find a landowner or a local who's around and just ask them whether it is okay to camp in that location. Remember that the future of the trail lies in your hands, and what you do now affects all the hikers that come after you. So please follow the rules. So camping, especially on the North Island, is probably the most popular type of accommodation you're going to find along the trail. But I'd say that probably second to that is going to be staying with trail angels along the way. The Te Araroa Trail is quite unique from some of the other long distance hiking trails in the world, because alongside that wilderness experience that you get, you also get a really fantastic cultural and community experience passing through some of these small towns, especially in the North Island. And so we are starting to build up this really great network of trail angels all down the length of New Zealand who are willing to help out hikers in their time of need. These people will do anything from just providing a piece of grass for you to pitch your tent on, right the way up to building hiker specific facilities for you to stay in, sleep in, cook in, shower in, and do all the things that hikers need to do when they get to a town. Now, whereas it might be quite easy for you to find accommodation as you're passing through some of the smaller and even the larger towns, there are still sections of the trail, even on the North Island, where it can be difficult to find appropriate accommodation for the night. And that's where the trail angels fill that gap. These are people that are just located along the Te Araroa route who open up their homes to hikers in places where you otherwise might find it quite difficult to find somewhere to stay. Now, you probably are always going to get a flushing toilet at a Trail Angels place, and I can't think off the top of my head whether there was anywhere I stayed that didn't have a hot shower of some kind too. But one thing that I would say about showers and about water at Trail Angels in particular is just bear in mind that especially up in the Northland region, which can be very dry, a lot of the Trail Angels along the route are actually having to get their water tanked into them because of drought. So if you are planning on staying with a Trail Angel, whether it's up in the Northland region or just anywhere along the trail, make sure that you ring ahead and check with them first that it's okay that you turn up. For people like that, water is an incredibly scarce resource. So if you don't need a shower, don't have one, and just make sure to only take what you need. So how much does it cost to stay at a Trail Angels place? Well, there is a cost involved, but most of the time with Trail Angels, they operate on a koha or donation basis. Now, koha in New Zealand doesn't necessarily mean a monetary donation, although that is by far and away the most popular way people choose to give their koha. It is possible to give your koha in some other way. For example, you might want to do a couple of jobs around the property for that person, or you might want to stop at a grocery store before you get to that Trail Angels place, pick up some extra supplies, and then cook a lovely dinner for the other hikers and the Trail Angel family that you're planning on staying at. Generally speaking, I was giving between $10 and $20 a night as koha for my Trail Angels, depending on what sort of facilities that they had. And the reason why I was giving that amount was because I equated it to what I would be paying to stay in a campsite in some of the larger towns. If the Trail Angel offered us things like a cold beer or another cold drink when we turned up, or they perhaps even cooked us dinner or breakfast like happened on a couple of occasions for me on the trail, then I would also make sure I included enough money to go some way towards covering those costs as well. Remember, I'm thinking not only about the future hikers that are coming through after me, but also about giving back to these Trail Angels who give so much of their time and effort to hikers every year. Now, because you're going to be paying a koha, you are going to need to carry some cash with you for this purpose. In general, I usually always carried with me between $50 and $100 in cash so that I could get myself through a section where there might be 2 or 3 Trail Angels along the way. Now, the third most common form of accommodation on Te Araroa is going to be hostels, backpackers and motels. Generally speaking, you're going to be finding these as you're passing through towns because that's just where they tend to be. And the cost for staying in these facilities can vary a little bit wildly. So for a backpackers, I'd be expected to pay anywhere between $15 and $35 to $40 per night. And for a motel room, obviously that's going to be a little bit more. I'd estimate anywhere between $80 to $150 or more dollars per night. Now, if you opt to stay in a motel room, obviously you could share that cost with a number of different hikers, but just bear in mind, just because you can cram 10 people into a motel room doesn't necessarily mean that that is permitted by the motel operator, so make sure you check ahead first before you do that. Now, the biggest question when it comes to these kinds of facilities is whether or not it is necessary to book ahead. Now, I did stay in a handful of backpackers and hostels along the way, and I did stay in a couple of different motels as well, and I have to admit that I never needed to book my room ahead. However, that doesn't mean that I got through completely unscathed. So up until the coronavirus situation worldwide, New Zealand was really booming in terms of its tourism, and it's become very, very difficult over peak periods especially to find a spare room or bed in some of our more popular tourist locations. In particular, I would say pay attention to 2 things. The first thing is, what kind of town is it that you are planning on staying in? If it's a particularly popular tourist town, then chances are you're going to find it more difficult to get that accommodation, and so you might want to book ahead. Paihia is definitely one of those towns where you might want to book ahead, and so is Kirikiri. Now, the problem with Kirikiri is that you also have a lot of what we call seasonal workers in Kirikiri at that particular time of the year who've come from overseas to get some work in New Zealand. And I struggled to find somewhere to stay in Kirikiri because of that. So booking ahead in that circumstance can really pay dividends. Secondly, you want to make sure that you're watching out for those peak times of the year as well. And these are the obvious ones like the Christmas and New Year holiday, but also just any time where it is school holidays in New Zealand over that summer period, so generally between the start of November and the end of January. If you're hiking through the North Island in the late January period, then you're also going to want to be mindful of the Auckland anniversary holiday and the Wellington anniversary holiday. Booking ahead is actually a very simple process, and for the most part you are going to have sufficient cell phone coverage along the Te Araroa trail to make those phone calls as you are hiking along. There are some sections where that cell phone coverage is going to be limited, so I'd say that if you are really concerned about a particular area, you make sure that you're trying to book ahead at least 4 or 5 days in advance. Generally speaking, it's relatively easy to plan where you're going to be about 4 or 5 days ahead. Okay, we are at the final option for accommodation on Te Araroa Trail, and it's actually my favourite one. That is the backcountry huts that you're going to come across along the way. Now, if you're not from New Zealand, you might not be fully aware of how our huts and our hut system works in New Zealand. So I'm going to try and give you a little bit of an overview here. So in New Zealand, we have a network of huts in our backcountry and in our wilderness areas, which are constructed by the Department of Conservation and other volunteers to provide safe refuges for hikers when they're out in the wilderness, and also just really cool places to go and stay at so that you can explore different regions around New Zealand. Along the North Island section of Te Araroa, I think I counted up, you're only going to come across around 13 different huts, and not all of them you're going to actually have to stay at along the way. There are a lot of different categories of huts, and they all vary in terms of how much they cost and what facilities you're going to have. It's pretty common for Te Araroa hikers to purchase a 6-month hut pass from a Department of Conservation office on their way through Auckland or another centre where they can pick it up. The hut pass is going to set you back $92 for that 6 months, and it's really going to come into its own on the South Island. Now, unless you are pretty confident that you are going to do a full through hike of Te Araroa, I'd recommend that you seriously consider whether you purchase your hut pass at the Auckland eyesight offices like most Te Araroa hikers tend to do. Why is this? Well, it's from my own personal experience. When I started the trail, I fully intended to go all the way to Bluff, and so I held off on purchasing my hut pass until I was hiking back through Auckland on my way southbound. I anticipated that I was going to need that hut pass for certain sections on the Whanganui journey, and then also through the Tararua Mountains, and then of course it was going to really come into its own on the South Island, where the majority of your accommodation every night is going to be in huts. But as it turned out, I never ended up on the South Island, and I didn't go through the Tararua ranges either. So I paid $92 for me to have this lovely little hut pass sitting in my wallet for the 2.5 months that I was on the trail. Now, you can get all the way down to the Tararua ranges without really needing a hut pass. The only hut or huts that you're potentially going to stay at before you reach the Tararuas are the Pohotia hut at the top of Mount Pirongia, and then also potentially the Boggin hut on the Timber Trail. Both of those you can buy individual hut tickets from the towns nearby as you pass through. By the time you get to the Tararuas, you're going to have a much better idea whether or not you're going to be completing the entire South Island, and so I'd encourage you to pick up your hut pass in Palmerston North if you can wait until that long. So how does the hut system in New Zealand work? Well, as a general rule, it is going to cost you to stay at any hut in New Zealand, and generally you would pay for these by going to your local eyesight or Department of Conservation office and picking up a hut ticket. Now, huts can range in prices quite substantially, and again we have a tiered level of huts in New Zealand, right the way from your basic huts with basic facilities all the way through to fully serviced huts that you're going to find on things like our Great Walks, which might have things like solar lighting and potentially even flushing toilets in some cases. For the most part though, the huts that you're going to come across on Te Araroa are going to be somewhere in the standard or basic category. Now, the cost to stay at basic or standard huts can vary quite wildly, but you're generally looking anywhere from between $5 to $15 a night if you're paying on a per night basis versus using your hut pass. The facilities that you're going to find at those huts can vary quite wildly, but generally speaking, you're looking at having a long drop toilet, some sort of cooking facilities, and in some cases at serviced huts, you're going to have a gas supply to those huts as well. You're also probably going to have some sort of heating source like a wood burner or a coal burner, although not all of the huts along the route have a heating source. And then generally speaking, you're going to have bunks with some sort of plastic mattresses on them that you can sleep on at night. In terms of water supply, most huts will have a rainwater collection tank which collects rainwater off of the roof, and most of them will also be nearby to some sort of a stream, so you can get water from either of those two locations. Even if you are getting water from those locations, I would always filter or boil it first, because you just can't guarantee what animals have been up on the roof or what might have gone into the stream that's nearby. Staying in huts really is a rite of passage for trampers and hikers in New Zealand, and I'd highly recommend you try and stay in as many as possible just for the experience. But just be aware that there are certain hut etiquette principles that you should follow if you're planning on staying in these huts. Make sure that you leave your dirty or wet boots and clothing outside the hut. There's usually a space reserved for this purpose. Once you're inside the hut, if you're using the benches and cooking facilities, make sure that you clean up after yourself, and of course make sure you pack all of your rubbish out. If you're going to be using the heating facilities inside the hut, then make sure you replenish the wood that you use and also leave some kindling out to dry for the next people that come along. On the morning before you leave the hut, make sure you clean out any of the spent ashes from the wood burner and put them in the specific disposal facility. You can sweep the floor if there has been a broom provided, and make sure you securely lock and fasten any windows and doors. One final note is please make sure that you are paying for the huts that you're staying in. Again, unfortunately, there are a lot of hikers along the trail and also Kiwi trampers who just don't pay for the huts that they're staying in, and that has knock-on effects further down the track for the use of those facilities in the future. Unfortunately, if we don't have the funds being paid for those huts, then there aren't the funds there to keep them maintained, and that means that they could end up being knocked down and people like me can't get out there and enjoy them in the future. So make sure you pay for those huts and look after our backcountry. Okay guys, so that is my summary of all the accommodation options on Te Araroa's North Island. If there's something that I have missed from this video, please go ahead and leave me a comment down below. Next week, I am going to be doing the first of my 1700 kilometer reviews of my big 3 items. And next week's topic is going to be my Z-Packs Arc-Haul pack. So make sure you tune in for that. Now that video will be uploaded a little bit earlier next week at 6:30 instead of the normal 7 PM New Zealand time, and that's because at 7 PM I am going to be hosting my first live Q&A on this channel. If you want to be a part of that, make sure that you are right here on this channel at 7 PM New Zealand time next Friday the 29th of May, and check the discussion tab where I will post the link to the Q&A. Other than that, if you like this video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. Make sure you subscribe to this channel and ding that notification bell. I'll see you guys next time.